screen share. That's brilliant. The next person I'm going to introduce is Ilona Boniwell. Now, I could decide to, go into explaining everything Ilona's done, but then I would take up the whole time of her speech. So I probably will choose not to do that. I will just say that she's probably, we probably have Ilona to thank for a lot of positive psychology having come to Europe, be it in terms of master's programs, in terms of the European Network of Positive Psychology, the books, everything else. It goes on forever. So thank you, Ilona, for being here. She's also the CEO of Positran, and Positran is a consultancy and training organization in France. They are partners of this event, and as such, I think we're also going to be hearing about something they're going to share with us all. So we've got that to look forward to. And so please do read her bio if you have a bit of time, but if not, just enjoy knowing that there's a few decades there of work in positive psychology and research and so on. On a personal note, because I've sort of tried to bring something personal, I would say that with Ilona, there's never a dull moment. And that's not to say that you can't sit down and have a cup of tea, but I do, if I remember rightly, the last time I sat down with Ilona to have a cup of tea, it was at dusk on a dune in the desert, and we had a tea party. So I'll just leave you with that and hand over to Ilona. Thank you for being here, Ilona.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That's a really good memory, isn't it? So I'm delighted to be here today with you and to give this talk. And actually, as I'm starting, I was thinking of my last sort of great memory with Lucy, and I think you'll be laughing now because there we go. So there we go, because this was actually the time when we presented a very long workshop to the government of Dubai on the happiness toolbox that we have developed for the government. So it was a really, really fun occasion running this workshop for 150 HR heads and all the different happiness officers to actually get them up to speed. So that was really an amazing event. And actually, surprisingly enough, it's about the same day as we were sitting on that dune having a cup of tea. So, by the way, I didn't know you were going to say that. so anyway, I'm really happy to see you all today. And I'm here to talk about positive psychology at work, which is a very, very large topic in a sense. So I was a little bit struggling to decide what to focus on. And I think some of you who know me, and I know you, there are some faces out there. For you, this talk might not be that new, because obviously I think you're working in this field already, like Sarah or Avi, for example. But for other people, hopefully there will be some elements that could be helpful for you. So as Lucy has mentioned, I do run a company called Positran, and you can pronounce it as Positran and Positran as well. And we are focusing on all different aspects of positive psychology at work, including training, coaching, higher education research, but also education and parenting, including in the work context, which is actually the area that has been receiving an increasing attention over the last year and a half. I never remember a different time when I was asked to give so many different keynotes on parenting for companies. And that's what I'm doing almost weekly nowadays. So, and I do have both aspects. One is very much an academic aspect, and another one is very much a practitioner aspect. So I'll be coming from both of them today. So I think we would all agree at the moment that organizations are changing rather rapidly. They're changing rather rapidly in terms of introduction of the remote work and adapting to the remote work, increasing use of technology, e-commerce, also major demographic changes, and especially major demographic changes in terms of COVID, in terms of having to move to different countries or being stuck in different countries sometimes without any possibilities to move. And I think you'll all be familiar with this wonderful acronym called VUCA that so beautifully captures the whole complexity, volatility, ambiguity, and uncertainty of the daily working life. I would also go as far to say that over the past, I would say, several decades, let's say 7 decades, the world of work has really undergone very, very, very major transformation. We have all moved from this world of work where the factories ruled, I would say, the world, to the world of work very much ruled by the financial people and financial necessities, which kind of collapsed a little bit after 2008. And finally, to this new world of work ruled by open hearts and open minds and different positive management and positive leadership trends, which sounds great, yet not actually that easy to integrate. Because one surprising thing, that despite the world of work moving much more towards positive management and positive leadership, we still have a surprising amount of mental health problems in the workplace. And even before the beginning of the COVID, different statistics on mental health conditions were already rather frightening. And depending on the survey you would look at, you would actually find some different numbers ranging from somewhere between 10 to 15 and even 20% of prevalence of mental health conditions in the workplace. So what happened next? I think we all know, and I'm not going to be reminding, but in the last year and a half, statistics have gone rather worse. And we are now talking about the intensification of the whole VUCA conditions in the workplace, and also intensification of the mental health crisis. My probably favorite study, because I've actually looked at quite a number of studies around intensification of mental health conditions, and one of the probably most solid studies, I would say, especially relevant to the UK, is coming from the UK household longitudinal data. And that's a study that's really measuring the symptoms of anxiety or depression every couple of years. So we can see the differences based on a very sound sample, the differences between different years. And so what we can see, for example, here is that in 2080, this survey finds something like 20% of prevalence in terms of symptoms of anxiety disorder or depression. And in 2020, this number goes up to 32. Just to mention, mainly the people who are mainly surveyed by this particular study are the working population. So they're mainly surveying employees. And what is happening in 2020, we are seeing the percentage of 31.8, with this percentage relatively stable across all different sample characteristics, regardless of the working hours, number of working hours, whether people had reduced working hours, for example, whether they were part-time or full-time. However, just to point out, the distress increased even more for people who were permanently laid off. Here we're talking about 69.4. So yes, I know, you can check it out. Great study. So if we look around the world, and this is the UN data, for example, comparing, we're not talking specifically about working population, we're talking about general population here that includes the working population. Different countries reported, again, different levels of stress and distress, with China going up to 35%, Iran up to 60%, not surprisingly. So I think we all are aware as to the reasons why, potentially, and US with multiple surveys pointing to something like between 42 and 45% prevalence, with certain population groups affected the most. By the way, this data demonstrates slightly higher numbers, but this is because we're not actually measuring the symptoms of depression and anxiety. We're measuring the people who are saying that the overall coronavirus had a negative impact on their mental health. But what this data shows that there are specific groups that are more affected. Females are more affected than males. Young people between 18 and 29 are more affected than other age groups, and different demographic populations such as, for example, Black people are more affected, and especially those people who have financial difficulties. So let's start on positive psychology. Of course, facing the current mental health crisis, we can have a number of different reactions. We can have the reaction, oh my God, what do we do and how do we solve it? And this is a very traditional reaction, in a sense, coming from the deficit approach, advocated by most management, I would say by most management literature, which would be really identifying problems, challenges, and trying to find the most appropriate solution to that. Or we can adopt potentially a more positive psychology approach to different challenges in the workplace, which is more an abundance approach, which is why we are all here today, which is much more about identifying the peak experiences, looking at organizations at their best, identifying what it is that enable that to happen, looking much more into the resilience and examples, for example, of resilient organizations under their current condition. And that would be much more of a positive psychology approach in the workplace. So in a sense, positive psychology would be much more moving from surviving into the thriving position and actually looking into the factors that enable us all to thrive, even in these current difficult conditions, which is what positive psychology at work for me is mainly about, is identifying the main ingredients of work thriving and trying to ensure that we actually invest into these ingredients. So what are the ingredients of workplace thriving? What are the major factors that we should perhaps talk about? What is thriving anyway? So if we look at the literature, there are probably two major positions to take. One is to zoom on well-being, and specifically workplace well-being, as one of the major indicators of thriving, of flourishing in an organization. And another would be to zoom onto engagement. So let me just quickly compare the two and have a look at the very latest data with regard to differences and similarities of impact of well-being and engagement. So well-being is something we all talk about, well-being in the workplace. It's absolutely everywhere. It's most of the time yellow. Most of the time it's picked up by all different organizations, sometimes presented in terms of yoga and healthy eating, and sometimes going a little bit further and integrated with mindfulness and meditation. But the question is, does well-being at work actually matter? I mean, what exactly do we mean by well-being at work? And does it actually matter? And why does it matter? So in order to conceptualize well-being at work, most of the time what do we take is actually work satisfaction as one of the proxy of workplace well-being, sometimes combined with some aspects of life satisfaction, sometimes measuring positive emotions at work and the prevalence of positive emotions at work, and sometimes also potentially measuring some very specific aspects of work satisfaction as well. So up until approximately 2012, I would say 2012, 2014, we were not quite certain what the impact of well-being on performance actually was. So in a sense, we had quite a lot of meta-analysis and studies indicating that there is some impact, and other meta-analysis considering that the impact is actually very much a marginal one, and sometimes even insignificant in terms of performance. So I would say that the recent decade has come up with a lot of really sound evidence that well-being is of value, definitely of value for the workplace. So we have evidence, for example, from companies actually looking at the impact of well-being on value added per hour in terms of productivity, demonstrating, yes, indeed, well-being does predict performance. We have studies that demonstrate that indeed we can see financial performance impact of well-being or labor productivity specifically, or even product and service quality. And we also do have some really interesting studies and results coming from different Gallup databases, where they would use the one item work satisfaction to see the impact of work satisfaction on organizations. And again, the results are quite convincing. We're talking about customer loyalty, staff turnover, productivity, and financial performance. So all of it is actually quite significant. The impact would range between something like 0.1 to 0.3 approximately in terms of correlation sizes. So it is something to really take into account. And what's also fascinating is that despite well-being at work being so fundamental for performance, work is not necessarily highly ranked as very important for well-being for people. There is a recent study that actually ranked, experience sampling study, that actually ranked all different types of activities in terms of well-being experienced. And out of 39 activities that they have studied, well-being came up the last one from the bottom, just the last one just before the bottom, and it's only superior to being sick in bed. So if you have to choose between suffering from coronavirus and work, you will be happier at work. Okay, that's a conclusion, but nothing else makes you happier than that. So, but everything else makes you happier than that. Sorry, a bit of a wrong conclusion. So, so despite of this impact, in terms of the actual population well-being scores, well-being is not, unfortunately, well-being at work or work is not actually very high on the list. So in order, however, to look at this picture a little bit more comprehensive, there is another variable that we need to take into account. Because yes, of course, job satisfaction is important, okay? It is a positive psychological state, but there are a couple of issues with it. So first of all, it describes the level of satisfaction that the employee feels at work, but this satisfaction is actually also affected by what they feel at home. So this differentiation, in fact, of satisfaction at work and at home is a little bit tricky sometimes. That's one issue. And secondly, satisfaction is generally characterized by a low level of activation, of emotional activation. So satisfied people generally feel calm and relaxed, which is fine. But at the same time, that may also mean that they might not be prepared to very much actively tackle, change, or improve things at work. So, which is why, in order to consider all the aspects of workplace thriving, we do also need to look at the more active attitude, which is generally called work engagement, which is also very much linked to job performance and organizational outcome, and even in a stronger manner than well-being. So what do we mean by engagement as a second major indicator of workplace thriving? What we mean by engagement is basically the extent to which employees would put discretionary effort into their work, as sometimes measured by the extra time, extra brain power, or extra energy, as opposed to disengagement, which is in a sense decoupling of oneself from the workplace or from our work role. Another sort of very common definition of work engagement would be coming from Wilma Schofferly, a psychologist from the Netherlands, who would define engagement as a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind that's characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption, with all these three components. So if we look at the value of engagement, what we do see is that there is a lot of evidence that's actually dating from the past 20 years, a lot of evidence coming from the work of Gallup, even though sometimes Gallup's definition of engagement is questioned, and we can discuss that if you would like afterwards. And generally what the literature is showing that indeed there is a lot of positive effect for the organizations and for the individuals in terms of better return of investment, extra performance, basically extra role performance, extra task performance, lower levels of sickness absence, much less incidents in terms of quality, safety, or patient safety incidents at work, increased customer satisfaction, loyalty, much more productivity and profitability, and we can really add a lot of numbers to compare organizations or teams in the highest level of engagement and the lowest levels of engagement, and also impact beliefs, because most of fully engaged employees would believe that they can impact overall the organization, quality of products or services. So in order to really conceptualize workplace thriving, what's really important is to try to look at both of those major indicators. And one of my favorite graphs, and it's not a very scientifically looking graph, but kind of a sympathetically, it's a really pretty looking graph, and it's actually a very clear graph, comes from a white paper, Engage from Success, from 2014, and actually shows rather nicely the importance of looking at both employee engagement and employee satisfaction in the workplace, basically showing that if we have both, this is really where we have both more productive and happy employees. And this is where we can actually talk about much higher impact in terms of numbers on their overall productivity, because even though both engagement and well-being do have independent impact, the impact is actually increased. So we're talking about something like 20%, 28% impact if we're looking at both of them, and 24 if we're looking at engagement, 21 approximately if we're looking at satisfaction. So the impact is higher if we are looking at both engagement and satisfaction, and there is a potential danger for those populations who are either very highly engaged but not satisfied, and also populations who are very highly satisfied and not engaged. So this one you can imagine potentially can lead to burnout, and this actually leads to feeling very cool, very nice, enjoying work, but not necessarily going this a little bit of an extra mile. So given that these are the two major indicators of both performance and also sustainable performance of that in a workplace, how do we get there? So in the literature, we would also find lots of different models looking into antecedents of workplace engagement and well-being. And here's just a bit of a table comparing those different models. And again, this is something to potentially discuss and go further. So what are those antecedents? So we have actually spent the past approximately 7 years working on gathering together these indicators into a consistent model and actually testing it in the workplace and measuring it in the workplace. So this overall picture I would like to present you is something called the Positive Organizational Profile that we finally published for the first time last year, but have been using it extensively over the past 5 years to actually measure well-being and engagement in different organizations across the world. So what we are talking here is really bringing together the outcomes of workplace thriving, specifically well-being, engagement, and also subjectively assessed results or more objectively assessed results in terms of supervisor assessed KPIs. So this is the outcome index here. And here what we're having is the antecedents index. So basically a collection of factors that predict, that each of them actually predicts in different fashion, in different way, their either well-being or engagement outcomes. So those factors can actually be conceptualized in three, I would say, overarching factors, as three overarching factors. One of them is looking at something we're calling the work environment. So here we're talking about organization as a whole. Another overarching factor is looking at the person's role, the person's job role within an organization. And another overarching factor is actually looking at the self, at oneself, basically as actually what it is that we are bringing to work. And so what are those sub-factors? What are so those levers of well-being engagement within those overarching factors? So if we are looking at self, which is actually what is very often missed in the vast majority of models. In fact, it's something that sometimes is picked up by some antecedent models, but it's actually something that most of the time we leave aside. And this is actually where positive psychology has a rather big role to play. So if we are looking at the self, are we actually seeing health and energy capital, optimism, flexible mindset, emotional competences, time competences, and meaning in life as some of the major predictors of well-being engagement, with probably the major one, individual major one, being the health and energy capital. That's actually what's coming up from the majority of research that we've done so far with private organizations or at the level of countries. So when we are looking at the role, which is basically what it is that I'm actually doing in my role, in my work role, here we have the flexibility or autonomy, basically one of the self-determination theory drivers, mastery and relationships, but also clarity and structure, which is actually a factor that's long highlighted by somebody like Professor Peter Warr in his vitamin model of well-being, importance of actually understanding what is expected of me and how what is expected of me needs to be delivered, variety of tasks specifically, and also meaning of work, which is different here from meaning in life. So this is my own meaning in my life more generally. Here we're talking about meaning of work. What's the meaning of my job for me? What's the meaning that I find in what I'm doing? And then you can talk about the work environment more generally. And work environment, there are different factors such as the climate of trust overall. Can I trust my colleagues? Can I actually share new ideas? Is it possible in this organizational environment overall to, let's say, propose something different, or is it going to be ridiculed, for example? Leadership, middle management, specifically managerial support and the structures behind the managerial support, career prospects and the possibility of growth and development in the organization. So here we're really talking about at the level of organization, basically structures at the level of organization. Work conditions, very simple in terms of presence of light and greenery, for example, in the workplace, in the presence of all the instruments that I need, and also believing in positive mission of my organization and the alignment between organizational values and personal values. So it's actually positive mission organization. And as you can see here, there are lots of things to say, obviously, and I'm not going to say all of them, but a couple of things to point out is that so what we are seeing is that there are different stronger predictor variables for well-being engagement. So there is a difference between them. There is a really consistent message around meaning at work, because in this model, the actual meaning has been conceptualized and empirically demonstrated as a combination of meaning in life, meaning of work, and positive mission. And when we measure this specifically meaning triangle, meaning in life, meaning of work, and positive mission of organization, we can see this particular triangle of combined meanings is actually the factor, the most predictive of the overall engagement. So it's actually the combination of the three rather than one individual one is actually where we need to invest. If we needed to invest into engagement, this would be the major starting point. And of course, many other lessons. What's important also to point out that all the sub-factors in the self category are actually sub-factors that we can impact in the workplace. These are not the sub-factors that are fundamentally concerned with somebody's personality. This is the sub-factors we can actually impact and develop in the workplace. So, for example, we can invest in emotional competence by, let's say, introducing mindfulness classes. We can invest into health and energy capital by providing gym access, or by facilitating working meetings, or by installing walking desks, for example, etc., etc. So all those factors are something we can do something about in the workplace. And so over the past 2 years, I'm getting older earlier than necessary. And so over the past 2 years, we've actually been working with the government of the Emirates, of the United Arab Emirates, to using this measure to actually measure the well-being engagement in the workplace in the public and private sector, and being able now to compare the public and private sector being 40,000 employees across different member states, and the private sector actually being representative every year, representative sample across all different industries, to actually see the differences between public and private, to be able to trace differences between different years. And what was fascinating is one of the conclusions, I cannot really share much more at the moment, was to see that between the year pre-COVID and last year of COVID, the well-being of workers in the private sector has slightly increased, which is a bit contradictory to what I've been saying in the beginning. But again, that what we can get to is more detailed measures. And the reason it's slightly increased by 4%, the main increase is actually explained by the increases in health and energy capital. People feeling less tired and sleeping more, for example. Okay, this is a country-specific, context-specific conclusion, but this is why it's actually interesting to do psychology, right? So I was also a little bit naive in thinking this presentation is going to take longer than 40 minutes somehow. So I was going to talk also about different details on positive, specifically positive leadership, which I'm going to skip, But I will actually finish this presentation by talking about the importance of positive work psychology in the future. So I think the first message I would like to share with this presentation, which is what I've been talking so far, is the importance of measuring, appropriate measuring, thin measuring, very precise measuring of both characteristics of workplace thriving and also the predictors of workplace thriving, if we want to actually take measures that are appropriate for different populations groups. So I think it's not just generally preaching workplace well-being and engagement, it's actually saying what it is that we can possibly do to impact the workplace engagement and well-being. And also one of the messages is that I've been working for the past 2 years to create a very comprehensive tool to find all the different techniques and solutions that we can actually do and use in the workplace to enhance well-being engagement if we identify the drivers correctly. But the second, perhaps, message here is what is the role of positive psychology and positive work psychology in the future? Because right now we are faced with this amazing, unprecedented crisis of COVID. We don't quite know how it's going to finish. We don't know where we're going to be in a year or 2 years from now. But what we do know is that regardless of how the COVID crisis is going to finish, there are also lots of other future trends that we can absolutely not ignore. And those future trends are varied, like exponential changes that we're currently facing in terms of population growth or CO2 emissions or technology development, AI reset, because what we're seeing at the moment is that artificial intelligence development is accelerating, and it's apparently been going through the AI winter for the past for a few years, perhaps 5 precedent years. Nowadays, we have entered more or less into the AI summer, and in the developments are much more rapid, and with machines starting to overperform humans in terms of behavioral predictions, emotional intelligence, psychology chatterboxes, and things like this. We are looking at something that's called identity multiplication as a future trend, or identity stack. I don't know if you have come across this term, which is really all about of how do we define ourselves? Because already definition of a human identity is a complex issue. I'm not going to go down this road. However, how do we define ourselves now across different channels? because it's not just about defining ourselves in the physical world anymore. It's about defining ourselves in a virtual world, in the game world, on different platforms, social media platforms. And what we are currently facing is the increased number of identities, which is something we haven't yet studied sufficiently to understand the continuity of those identities across different channels. And nevertheless, this is something that's going to impact psychology, absolutely. Deep hybridity. Deep hybridity is another future trend, which is a blend of the physical, biological, and digital worlds, which is something that we really need to be aware about. And the new normal will be a place where all these worlds mix and mingle in our daily experience. And finally, we can't forget about this really interesting trend, which is called the disappearance of jobs. Within the next 40-45 years, 50% of jobs are predicted to have disappeared. And what's really interesting is the data shows that when we are looking into retraining of employees, the success rate is something between 0 and 15%. So, what's the role of positive psychology at work in the future? And I think I'll leave you to think of all those different possibilities, but these are just some possibilities, which is really about development of resilience and cognitive flexibility, some possibilities which are really about the encouragement of spiking, because actually evidence demonstrates that we succeed not when we are all-rounded, we succeed when we are spiky, when we invest disproportionately into our strengths. Musk is a really good example here. It's also about psychology and positive psychology playing a role in growing psychological security in relationships that are increasingly remote. It's really potentially about integration of something like life and job crafting into employee life cycle, because we will be reinventing ourselves much more rapidly than we are currently doing. And I would also say it's really ensuring that the jobs or workplaces of the future are all well-being hubs. So I think there is a huge role of positive psychology for positive psychology to play. If you, by the way, wanted to explore, I'm not going to talk much more about it at the moment, digital solution to strengths, you actually have a free code that would enable you to try and test a positive 360 solution to identification of strengths. And also, if you wanted to go further and really discover a little bit more about team strengths identification, please contact us for a free code as well to try. But I think I would like to finish, not necessarily on a marketing pitch, but on also some considerations of positive psychology at work and some of the lessons of practice. And there are just a few lessons I would like to share. I think one is we would like to believe that positive psychology at work is fundamentally based on the positive demand. Saying how can we take it further, how can we ensure even high engagement, how can we ensure even higher well-being. In reality, though, I would say the demand is about 20% positive and about 80% mitigative in nature. So I think this is something that we need to be consciously aware of, that even though we would like to go into the abundance approach heads on, it's not always possible because the demand very often combines the two. I think another lesson overall from practice is that, unfortunately, one of interventions that we very often propose in the workplace can be useful, of course, but at the same time, their usefulness is very limited. And unless there is a systemic approach to actually integrate the new behaviors and support the new behaviors in the workplace in a really systemic fashion, most of the time, unfortunately, the results will be disappearing after about 6 months max. I think another lesson is that the science of the real world practice sometimes is missing a little bit, which is a shame. And I think this is where positive psychology needs to go much further. integration with organizational psychology is really, 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 really essential. And it's probably not done sufficiently. So there are two separate universes of organizational psychology and positive psychology at work, working kind of sometimes without much interaction. And what is another interesting question is sometimes it's really not clear what is the real added value of positive psychology at work. Because in fact, there is so much coming already from organizational psychology, from the management science, that sometimes it's very difficult to estimate what positive psychology can actually add to the workplace. Is there any added value? And this is something, again, I would love to explain. I would love to expand on quite a lot further, but I'm also aware that I'm completely out of time. So I'm going to thank you for your attention. And I'm going to stop here. And if we have any time for questions, I'll be really happy to exchange further.